Dr. Nash is the author of 2 award-winning books, both published by Duke University Press. The first is titled The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, and the second is called Black Feminism Reimagined, After Intersectionality. A third book, Birthing Black Mothers, is forthcoming in 2021. Her work has been supported by many fellowships and organizations, and this book that we're going to be talking about today, Black Feminism Reimagined, is a meticulous account of the so-called intersectionality wars insofar as they shed light on the psychic life of Black feminism and the emotional, intellectual, and service labor that Black feminists are asked to do for and in Black studies. So before I sort of begin things with an opening question, I hope this is okay with you, Jen. I wanted to share my screen and just show the final paragraph from your book, if that's okay. Hold on one second. Here it comes. Is everyone able to see that? Good? Yes? So I wanted to just kind of read these closing lines of Jen's book, not as a spoiler. I hope it's not a spoiler, but really because I think it so clearly articulates the stakes of this important project, and because it gives us a trenchant critique of the field of women's studies at the same time as it glimpses an inspiring and bold future for Black feminism. I guess I also just say I'm learning that in the age of Zoom, it's really good to just front load things and to get straight to the point. Who knows what's going to happen in the next hour, right? So I just thought I would start with some brilliance from Jen's book. So she writes, "My wish for Black feminist theory that can name the fatigue, the tiredness, and even the violence that comes with always being made a symbol, even if that symbol is seemingly a productive one. A figure that can save the field of women's studies from its history, its ongoing violence, effectively rescuing it from itself. I dream of a Black feminist theory that puts pressure on women's studies to recognize the utopian world-making work of our still unfolding political dreaming, which includes, but also exceeds intersectionality. My wish is for a Black feminist theory that refuses to perform service work for women's studies, and that instead compels the field to reckon with its own racially saturated fantasies and attachments. I want this reckoning not to take the form of gratitude, appreciation, or apology, the primary forms that circulate in both popular and academic feminisms, but to instead include a deep historical engagement with the labor that Black women, Black feminists, and Black feminist theories are regularly called upon to perform for women's studies, effectively shoring up women's studies' own claims to virtue. Letting go untethers Black feminism from the endless fighting over intersectionality, the elaborate choreography of rescuing the analytic from misuses, the endless corrections of the analytic's usage. Letting go allows us to put the visionary genius of Black feminism to work otherwise. It is thus a practice of freedom." Okay, so I guess just to start, Jen, I would love it if you could actually just start by talking to us about your journey from your first book to your second book. And I'm teaching a seminar this semester called Black Feminist and Queer Insurgencies, and I know in my class we have some big fans of both your first book and your second book, but in many ways there's key differences between these books. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us about how you got from the articulation of Black women's desires and pleasures in 1970s and 80s hardcore pornography to the institutionalization of Black feminism and the intersectionality wars in the academy.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. It's such an honor to be here today. Britt, it's always awesome to be in conversation with you. I'm so excited. And thank you for the questions. Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I think there's always a kind of like retrospective sense making that one does when you're called upon to narrate the through lines of your work. And sometimes I think that kind of retrospective sense making can lose sight of the fact that we also come to our projects from our situatedness, right? So one of the things that happened between my first book and my second book was I started chairing women's studies at George Washington University. And so I became very interested in how I would describe our program's strengths, virtues, and urgency, particularly to our administrators, which required me to speak a certain language. And in the context of that university, it was a language about how women's studies was training students to think intersectionally and transnationally and preparing them to be global citizen students, right? Like that was our snappy pitch. And so it was interesting for me to make that snappy pitch in the desire to secure resources and to ensure that we were not precarious, all the while remaining really curious about what it meant to say that that's the work that we did when we had a class that was focused on Black feminism, right? And no classes that were focused on transnational feminist theory. But we knew that this was the language we had to speak because it was what was demanded of us to ensure our survival. So I think that's sort of like the lived context that gave birth to the project, and a desire to understand. Now I've been at 3 institutions, to understand the work that Black feminism generally and intersectionality specifically is called upon rhetorically to perform in women's studies. I think the through lines between the books, like the retrospective through lines now across the 3 books, are really trying to think about what different actors mean when they talk about Black women. I'm interested in how Black women become symbols of various sorts. So in the first book, I'm trying to think about how a group that I'm a part of, Black feminists, think about Black women in relationship to representation. And so that first project was born out of a desire to think about how the possibilities of Black women being represented in pleasure on the pornographic screen was an impossibility, because Black feminism contained a theory of what Black woman was and what representation was. And the second book, I mean, I think in its broadest, I'm trying to think, what is Black woman symbolically invoked to do in the context of academic feminism? And how did we, and I feel this even more now after the book has circulated, how is it that Black women, Black feminism and intersectionality, all of which are conflated in the space of academic feminism regularly, how are we constantly being told that we can save the field, right? Or that we have saved the field already, even as that's not necessarily the way that we're valued in our home institutions. So always with this desire to understand the ways in which Black women function as symbols or metaphors across different institutional sites and spaces. And I'm also interested, and this is my third project, in how Black feminists ourselves also are invested in the project of making Black women symbols of certain sorts as we try to garner particular kinds of resources and security. So I think that's, you know, where life and work intersect, right? There are the life questions, and then there's a kind of enduring intellectual preoccupations.
That's really great. Thank you. I guess, again, I'm just kind of going to jump. I started with the end of your book, and now I want to ask you about like what's happened since your book came out. I'm really curious, you know, this year has just been such an intensive year in terms of thinking about emotional labor, intellectual labor, kind of like intensive reorganizations of the university, budget crises, so many different things happening at so many different levels in the world and also just institutionally. So as I was revisiting your book this past week, I was wondering what you might have to say about the status of intersectionality like right now, if you were to write a postscript to this book about intersectionality and the status of Black feminism and Black feminist theory right now in the COVID era. I would be really curious to hear like what sorts of dynamics in your book you see intensifying, what changes you've seen, you know, questions about shifts in conversations in academic feminism and then Black feminism beyond the academy. Yeah, just what are you thinking about that, given the really intensive sort of pressures and I think sort of pretty intensive reconfigurations around institutionalization that's happening like right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's so many things. I mean, I'll just lay out some thoughts that come to mind as you pose that question. So I think one of the things that the book gestures to that I've become more interested in is how intersectionality, hailed as the thing that saves academic feminism, has this kind of flip side. It's the evil antagonist white feminism. And so I'm always interested in how those two things are held in tension. And so I think of the moment in May 2020, I think it was May 2020, when the country turned its attention to Central Park and Amy Cooper. And of course, we were all at home, or many of us were at home. So we all sort of have this particular attention given to this event. But Amy Cooper sort of became this icon of white feminism, if white feminism can have an icon. And we might, as I always ask, like, what particularly is feminist about any of the folks who are described as white feminist? But she, along with, various other Beckys and Karens, became icons of a kind of feminism that must be disavowed, that white women are thought to embody, and that Black women are thought to save us from. And so I think part of the story that I continue to be interested in is how white feminism and intersectionality get held as opposites, how white feminism gets described as the thing we must cut out from the corpus of feminism in order to move to a different kind of future, and intersectionality and Black women are imagined as offering us a particular kind of future that we must always already be moving towards. So I think about that. I think about, and I'm writing about this now, I'm trying to make sense of it, the sort of new forms of institutional genres that have emerged this year. I would imagine this is the case at UMass also, but like in the wake of George Floyd, my institution issues a response to any act of violence now, right? But not only does my institution do that, like Amazon and Ben and Jerry's and Sephora, they all, right, Nike, they all offer responses. It's become a kind of institutional genre that seems to stand in for political work. And so I think there's something really interesting about that. My first week, before I even got to Duke, the first conversation I was a part of was like, we need to write a response to George Floyd's murder. Like, we need to craft a response. And that sense of urgency and responsiveness as a kind of political act seems to me worth thinking about, alongside something else that's happened, at least at my institution, which is like hearing deans and provosts and others draw on a language that to me feels very Black feminist, which is this kind of language of care and love. We particularly had this conversation here at Duke this year in the fall. There was no fall break, right? We just sort of moved through the semester. And the sense of collective fatigue was overwhelming, really overwhelming. And so in the spring, we've had these 2 wellness days, largely because of student activism. And so suddenly our deans are using this language of, we need to care for ourselves. Care is important. The care of self is important. And so it's really fascinating for me always to see when language that for me comes out of a particular Black feminist tradition gets mobilized institutionally, and is also often always empty. So like, I think of this alongside earlier this year when a group of faculty who are caregivers, particularly of small children, were organizing around the fact that we were all working with small children at home. And the response that we got from the institution was, we see that you're doing that. That's hard. We see it, we notice it. That's hard. And that felt very different for me than care. So I think, if I were to write a postscript, it would be weaving all of these kind of themes together. Oh, and I guess the last piece was, there was also that moment after George Floyd when Americans were reading their way out of racism, right? Like, so the New York Times bestsellers list was like all books on how to transform yourself, right? So many of them written by Black feminist academics who do public facing work. So like someone like Brittany Cooper or Crystal Fleming. And so I was really curious about that moment, in part because of the sense that, again, like if you read the right books, the self could be transformed and racism could be ended. That racism, that anti-Blackness in particular, is about a kind of working on the self, is a particular, but to me, particularly odd way of thinking about how anti-Blackness operates. But it was also really interesting to me, again, connected to the first answer about how Black women become these symbols, this idea that if we follow what Black women tell us, they've given us the blueprint, right? They've offered us the path. And it was really interesting to sort of see that moment perform spectacularly, even, and to relate it to this kind of idea of institutions writing responses. One of the things that my department did, as many others did, was we offered a reading list, right? Here are 10 books you can read this summer. Here's a primer on how US racism works. And it was so interesting to see the central role of Black women, Black feminism, and intersectionality, that we included Kimberly Crenshaw, we included Hortense Spillers. We were like, these are the texts you can read to cure yourself, right? So I think all of that, that would be a messy coda postscript, but I think all of that together would probably go into the postscript.
Yeah, I'm really struck by this, like this idea of I've been thinking a lot about the politics of these statements, and I really like your reframing of them as a kind of like new institutional genre. To think about that as a genre is really, I mean, that's really helpful. And it's really tricky, right? Because you don't want to say yes to the statements, but you also don't want to say no. I yeah, I mean it's I think it's it's really tricky. To say nothing is as problematic as to say something. And so just I think it's really helpful to think about it as a kind of genre and to imagine other genres, other ways of intervening. You know, I think that's really helpful and interesting. That language of the care of the self is also recalling for me Foucault's idea about, you know, that to me also strikes me as like a kind of like late biopolitical kind of move where that's been our this whole year, right, has been this like intensive demand to care for the self or to cure the self, and how, you know, care and health and has been so intensively individualized, and that we're not just responsible for our own individual health or the people we're connected to, but to everyone in society. And that is a really intense way to kind of like outsource collective demands or just structural transformation or, you know, overhauling of the healthcare system, and to think about how that kind of like burden put on individuals does end up working out in institutional spaces. And it's I think it's really intense. And even just the language you use about like how to transform yourself, it's just been such I mean, everyone's talking about the isolation of this past year, but the intense form of like structural kind of like individualization that's happening, and what that means particularly for POC, for queer and trans folks, for Black women. It's just it's a really intensive way to think about the kind of the intensification of the kind of burdens of emotional and intellectual labor, I think, that you trace in your book. And also, I guess I would just say that the organizing around, I was just also thinking it's really interesting too how, since we're moving further along in the pandemic, I think we're starting to use the narrative of like we were at home with our small kids, and, you know, like I'm still at home with a small child, and many of us are still don't see an end to this, right? And so I think it's also how we're narrating that crisis, and how that care crisis that we're seeing is, you know, something that Black feminists have been pointing out and have been analyzing and have been mobilizing around for decades. So to think about that longer history, I think, is really interesting and helpful as well. I was really struck in your book, Jen, in revisiting in like how your book details, you know, how Black women are sort of locked into this labor of Black feminist vigilance. And specifically, you talk about kind of locked into this labor of protecting and defending intersectionality. And in your book, you know, you talk about how, in terms of the labor that Black women and Black feminists are asked to take on, that they're asked to hold on for the institution, for women's studies. And your book is this experiment in like advocating a letting go, this practice of what would it mean for Black feminists and Black feminists to let go. And, you know, again, in sort of thinking about this past year, I think this has been a year not just of vigilance, but hypervigilance in the context of the pandemic, of like multiple racial and gendered political and economic emergencies. And, you know, just thinking about my own students' expressions about the feelings of hypervigilance that they're feeling like at home, on the street, in their community, at school. And so, yeah, just that language of vigilance was really striking to me as I was revisiting your work. And I don't know, I was just also wondering if you had anything more to say about these dynamics of how you've been thinking about those dynamics of letting, of kind of like holding on and letting go, given where we're at right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's interesting to hear you think about what it means to talk about vigilance in the context of the pandemic, where we were all in the face of the state doing essentially nothing, right, for us. We were all required to become individual, self-monitoring, hyper-vigilant, right, in the service of maintaining ourselves. And I mean, I think one of the enduring sentiments, at least for me, from this last year is just exhaustion. And to go back to your point, right, about how the narrative has changed. If the narrative a year ago was stay at home, flatten the curve, at least the narrative at my institution is like, the end is in sight. We're almost there, right? Which of course serves an institutional narrative, because the expectation is that in the fall we're going to be 100% back in person, right? So right. So part of the, and I have actually felt the mood change in the last like couple of weeks, and some of it is like I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and it's spring, and so some of it is that, but some of it is also we keep getting this messaging from our institution that yeah, things are fundamentally shifting, and we're going to go back to normal in the fall, right? And so I think there's a way in which that entirely hides precisely what you're talking about, right? Which is like, so many of my colleagues are still as intensively caregiving now as they were 10 or 11 months ago, right? But our institution has been like, oh, no, have hope. So I think there's something really interesting about the kind of institutional needs that serves. To the point about, exhaustion, I mean, one of the reasons why as I said, all books come out of one's location. So this book started when I was teaching at George Washington University, and I wrote the bulk of it when half of myself was in Black Studies at Northwestern. And I was really interested in how much I saw performed among my students and my colleagues, this sense of like, this is our turf, our territory, we made it. And if we didn't make it, our elders made it. And they made it through labor, sweat, blood, giving their lives. And so it's our job to police these boundaries, right? Whether it's the boundaries of intersectionality or the boundaries of what constitutes Black thought more broadly. And I actually felt like this is exhausting us. We spend more, this is literally wearing away our bodies and stealing our intellectual energy, because we spend more time debating in the context of intersectionality, who did it, who gets to use it, are you citing the right texts? Are you reading Crenshaw correctly? Why are you reading Crenshaw, not Anna Julia Cooper, right? Go read those texts better, right? Like we spend so much time having those conversations, right? Or, as I argue in the book, insisting that intersectionality is under siege from critics and that we have to protect it. So much of our energy goes towards that. I think that Black feminists, I think, haven't yet been able to sort of truly lean into our creative and visionary possibilities, which is like, my starting point is, I don't think we yet know all that Black feminism can imagine or do, but I don't think we can even begin to imagine the scope of the tradition that we are stewards of when our preoccupation is with guarding territory. And as I argue in the book, the imperative towards vigilance comes out of this complicated relationship between Black women, Black feminism, and US women's studies. And I would argue, I mean, there's another book to be written about Black studies, but that's not this book, right? There's a complicated relationship there too. But I really wanted to think about how the Black feminist defensive posture that I'm grappling with is actually about the racial politics of women's studies, and not at all about sort of like Black women's pathologies. That's not at all the point of the project. The point of the project is to think about how academic feminism has offered us a narrative that intersectionality is the corrective that we need to get right, right? And then Black feminists have sort of come in to guard this territory from it being expanded, misused, taken up, appropriated, colonized, all words that I talk about in the book. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm really interested in exhaustion and what it means for Black feminists to be intellectually and psychically and corporeally exhausted from this ongoing process of kind of guarding and marking territory. So my interest in the book and always is like, for me, Black feminism doesn't mean correct, right? Which I think is so often how it gets used in academic feminism, right? Like it means a correct or more complex or more nuanced perspective, or just like the right one, right? Like I'm not interested in Black feminism claiming moral certitude or in a Black feminist reading of a particular representation or text as being the right one. I'm interested in a capacious Black feminism that can think with a whole set of objects and methods. And I'm always drawn to a Black feminism that can engage with what makes us uncomfortable, which I guess is another thing about the first book, right? Like, what are the places that Black feminism hasn't wanted to touch historically because it makes us uneasy? And what would happen if we claimed those spaces rather than retreating from them?
Yeah, and it really strikes me that I really love in your book that you do give us those like little glimpses into like what if we could imagine a genealogy of Black feminism that comes out of Black studies rather than out of women's studies. And I know that's not this book, but when I've taught your work, that's my students in Afro-American studies often latch on to that kind of narrative to think about, well, that also is like to kind of think about like different histories and different genealogies is helpful in terms of perhaps moving beyond that intensive interpolation of Black women and Black feminists into the institution via intersectionality. And I think your book is also just, really helpful in making us continue to interrogate, like, what does it mean when women's studies or gender and sexuality studies programs say that their method is an intersectional method, or that their program is structured around intersectionality. I think your work shows us that is all well and good. It might be a fine horizon, but it doesn't actually attend to the fact that Black women and Black feminism remains a problem in and for women's studies, and that there's an excess there that can't be accommodated, won't be accommodated, and it's a further incorporation of intersectionality into gender and sexuality studies isn't going to solve that surplus or that problem. And I really appreciate your work in this project for that reason. And the fact that I was again trained in the department where you now are, and I remember really, in graduate school believing something about like disagreement and dissensus and the critic, and that and I also really appreciate that you ask, like, what could it mean for Black feminism to actually be open to the critic, and in terms of thinking about that as a kind of like about embracing Black feminism's like possible expansion in terms of this world making and a kind of like unleashing of its power, I think is just really really fascinating and really great. So I was going to ask you, there is also a kind of like, even though your book isn't really framed in this way, there is a lot of interest in affect. You talk about Black feminist affects like defensiveness, you talk about loss, you talk about grief. And so I don't know if would you want to just talk a little bit more about how you understand this book in terms of your interest in what you call Black feminist feelings?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think, I teach a class, I have taught a class many years, a graduate class, that my students call the affect class, but I call it theory and emotions. And one of the impulses of that class is to offer my students an introduction to a thing called affect through Black feminist scholarship. So we read Patricia Williams's Alchemy of Race and Rights. We read Ntozake Shange's For Color Girls. We read Audre Lorde's Cancer Journals. Part of what I want to do is to counter for them a kind of entrenched conception of what affect is, that it's, what affect theory is, that it's Fekovich and Berlin and Kathleen Stewart, that it's a tradition that emerges apart from Black studies and apart from Black feminist studies. So one of the questions that I'm always interested in is, what are the variety of ways that we can read the Black feminist intellectual tradition? And one of the ways that I try to think about that question in this book is to think, what if we read it as a tradition about feeling, right? Which is something I've continued to grapple with, also sort of expanding that to think, what if we also think about it as a tradition that does its work around feeling by experimental and beautiful writing? So I think I'm still sort of playing with what it means to read this tradition as one that's fundamentally about feeling, but that feels important to me. And so I think what I wanted to do in the book is to sit with how the university, for so many of us, particularly those of us in fields that Robin Wiegman calls the identity knowledge fields, right? We come to those fields with intense attachments and desires, political attachments and political desires, and affective attachments and desires. And so it felt important for me to name that. So much of what I see happening in what I call this kind of defensive posture is about what I think Black feminists feel like intensely when we see, I used to always tell the story when I would teach intersectionality to my undergrads, when a white male student would talk about their intersectional experiences as a heterosexual white man from New Jersey, right? And I could see students who identified with Black feminism, like sort of, oh my God, right? It was kind of like not just an affront, but it was felt so deeply and intensely. And I wanted to think through that. And these are questions that I still think through. I mean, one of the things that I notice and that I'm curious about as I continue to think about the felt life of Black feminism in the American university is this, I will often hear it narrated this way by colleagues who work in the field, that Black feminism is much more than an intellectual tradition. People will talk about it as a calling, as something that saved them, as something in a kind of Jackie Alexander way, like as kind of like spirit work, right? And as work that seeks to do justice to a variety of things, including the felt life. And so I want to take that seriously. And so I think that's some of what underpins my desire to think affectively about Black feminist thought and the Black feminist tradition.
I do want to ask you a question. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A, and I want to ask you a final question about mentorship. But I am wondering what you think about certain iterations of Black feminist work out and organizing outside of the academy. Again, in this class I'm teaching this semester, we're like currently doing a unit on Black feminist like armed defense and community defense. And so some of the affects that you talk about in your book that seem like really exhausting and like debilitating in an academic context somehow feel a little different when we move outside of the academy. So we read like Taya Miles's piece on Black women and gun ownership. We've been thinking about like Black feminists like, you know, security, armed defense, also like kind of theories, Foucauldian theories, and working around territory and territorialization. And so like there is this kind of, I don't know, I think a certain popular movement of thinking about forms of Black feminist defensiveness that seem maybe not so bad. And so I was just curious if you had some thoughts about like, do some of these affects look or feel differently in a non-institutional or in a more popular context?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think I was drawn to thinking about the university because it's been such a site of struggle for Black feminists, right? And so we can think about, you know, Barbara Christian asking us if Black feminism can survive the academy. We can think about Andrew Seal and A Cult of True Black Womanhood struggling with what it means to have made a field, and then to see folks with no expertise come and get jobs in that field, right? We could think about the moment when Grace Hong lists the names of Black feminist academics who she argues are now dead. And so we can think, I mean, there's this long-standing preoccupation with the university, with carving space for Black feminist knowledge production in the university, and then arriving at a moment that's so different that when Barbara Christian asks, can Black feminism survive the academy? It's like we now have tenure lines in Black feminist theory, right? We have journals. We can no longer claim that we are, I don't think we can any longer claim that we are outside of the institution. We're uncomfortably in it. And so I think that's the particular iteration of defensiveness that I'm thinking about, right? It's fundamentally linked to all of the complexities of institutional life for Black feminists. I don't think defensiveness is inherently the claim of the book is not that defensiveness is inherently problematic, right? My desire is to think about how it gets practiced and manifested in a particular context. I think for many folks, defensiveness can be quite empowering, right, in a variety of ways. And then the last thing to your question, you know, and where I thought your question was going at the beginning, one of the things that strikes me so much is just how public-facing Black feminist work is. It always has been. I mean, this is Brittany Cooper's point in Race Women, that Black feminists have always been public intellectuals. But I'm particularly struck now by how much my undergraduates are learning. They're learning as much from, you know, reading Crenshaw in my class as they are from watching Rachel Cargill on Instagram, right? And so, or from reading popular texts like Hood Feminism. Like, so I think there are there are various forms of Black feminist scholarship unfolding that are speaking to different kinds of publics. And that to me feels new and really important. And to your earlier question about this kind of long COVID moment, right? There's this incredible market for public-facing Black feminist work. There's a hunger for it. And we'll see how long that hunger lasts, right? This is the cynic in me. But I think I increasingly see how intensely public-facing Black feminist work is and how much demand there is for that kind of writing.
And an intensive production and sort of cultivation of what Black feminism means in those popular realms by agents, by editors, that the popular is not just free from these norms and structures of power. It's I think, right, it is that in that popular realm, I'm learning something about how also there's just a set of demands being placed on Black feminists in the public sphere as well. They might just be different than what we see in the institution. Okay, great. So Jen, given the occasion of this symposium in honor of the dynamic and amazing teaching and scholarship and mentorship of our beloved Alex Deschamps, I was wondering if you would talk to us a little bit about mentorship, especially among women of color, faculty of color. How do you think about maybe feminist mentorship? How do you think about it? How do you practice it? How have you benefited from it? And, you know, maybe a broader question. I would love to hear if you just want to say something about like feminist friendship or like what friendship means in these spaces, and perhaps how friendship actually can be life-saving given the kind of dynamics that you trace in your book.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've had the best mentors. I still everything in my academic life has been made possible by having an amazing mentors. And so when I think about what I see them do and what I try to practice in my own relationships with mentees, students, one of the things that I've really appreciated is I feel like my mentors from graduate school on have always been transparent about the things that academia makes opaque. And so, I mean, I remember when I was a graduate student at Harvard, and we all had this sense of just the misery of the tenure system at Harvard, but it was all like shrouded in secrecy and opacity. And there was one member of my committee who was still an assistant professor, and she pulled me into her office and she was like, "I don't want to do this." And I was kind of like, what do you mean? You don't want to do what? And she was just like, "I don't want to do this. Like, they bring me here, they're going to chew me up and spit me out. And like, I'm not going to stay here." And we ended up having this long conversation about tenure and what that looked like, which I feel like now feels so obvious to me, but as a graduate student felt so completely opaque, right? Like, and she was a person in my life who, in the early part of my academic life, who would have frank conversations about money and negotiating, something else that people in academia don't like to talk about, right? About time, and also about how to have a livable life. She was the only person in my department at that time who had small children, which says something. But she was always very transparent about what it meant to be juggling so many things and to be fundamentally committed to having a livable life. So that kind of ethic of transparency is something I try to carry with me as I work with my students, particularly my graduate students. The second thing I think, so I had a fellowship for a year, mid-tenure track, and Nicole Fleetwood at Rutgers was my mentor for the year. She's the best. And we had this wonderful moment. Like, I had showed her a draft of what would become the first book. And she said it so nicely. She was like, "You don't have to slay your elders." I was like, "Wait, what do you mean? I was trained in graduate school that what you do is you pick fights and then you draw blood." And she was like, "You don't have to do that. That's not a Black feminist ethic." And it was actually really liberating for me, because I think what I had learned in graduate school was you identify a problem in the literature and you essentially implode everything that has come before you to make visible the necessity and urgency of your own work. And so realizing that didn't have to be how I set up the importance of my project was really liberating. And then I think the mentors who have been the most meaningful for me have always been committed to giving me tips on writing and how to prioritize the writing, which becomes, as you know, more and more challenging as we juggle more and more things, right? And so they've reminded me again and again, pay yourself first. Don't start the day with an email, right? Writing an email is not writing. Those are reminders that I have needed. As we all know, as we move through the ranks, we end up doing more and more and more service work, and our writing time quickly becomes drafting reports rather than articles and books. On feminist friendship, I went to a conference many years ago on something that I don't exactly work on, which is transnational feminism. I mean, I guess I kind of think about it, but I don't work on it. It was a conference celebrating Inderpaul Graywell and Karen Kaplan, and one of for me the most touching moments was when they talked about co-writing Scattered Hegemonies, co-editing it, and having a moment where each of their deans said, "Can you offer us an account of how much of the work each of you did, so we know how much of it should count for tenure?" And they both said they were committed to saying, we each did 100% of the labor, which I thought was such a beautiful, beautiful way of responding to what is such a soul-sucking question. But it reminded me that nothing about institutional life, particularly in the humanities, is set up to recognize or value collaboration. I think of it when I was going through promotion here and I had to account for like, when you were engaged in this collaboration, what percent effort was it, right? And so for me, it's become really generative to just be like, no, we both did 100% of the work. And actually that in thinking together, working together and writing together, we're pushing against all of the norms about what counts, how it counts, what counting means. So yeah, I have a friend, collaborator, co-conspirator, Samantha Pinto, who's at UT Austin, with whom I do a lot of work. And for me, that collaboration has just been a lifeline. And I think our friendship has included all the things I talked about around mentoring. I mean, I think we've seen each other through the tenure process and been transparent with each other about what that looks and feels like. And we've talked about how you negotiate and what you can ask for and how you're expected not to ask for anything. We've reminded each other to say no to things again and again and to write. So yeah, I think that's some of what I would say about friendship. And I guess the last piece is, I think everything in the university is set up to make cross-rank relationships hard, right? I noticed that when I was junior faculty, and I thought, oh, that's not going to be me. And I intensely feel it now. And so, I came here to Duke and wanted to start a writing group that was cross-rank. And it's actually proven harder, but I think more important to do, harder than I thought, and thus more important than I could have ever imagined, right? Like, what does it mean for us to share our work across rank and to be vulnerable with each other and to refuse the idea that being associate or being assistant means something inherent about the value of the work, right? But I think there's a way in which those titles really come to order sociality in academic life, and we have to push against that and refuse it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
So we're going to move into some questions. I actually wanted to give Alex the chance to ask a first question. Alex, I'm not sure your relationship to your own symposium, if you want to be involved or if you are going to enjoy the experience of just sitting back and listening. So I want to give you the option to ask the first question if you would like to take that opportunity, but no pressure at all. And Banu has said there in the chat, if Alex decides she wants to say something or ask a question, if you have questions that you want to ask Jen, you want to contribute to the conversation, please put them into chat. And I will, depending on how many we get, I will ask one, or if we get a lot, I may read a few and then give Jen a chance to respond to some questions.
Okay. I did intend to sit back and listen. But I actually do want, Kevin, I'm having a hard time doing this speaker view.
We've got you. You're good.
Okay. But Jennifer said a couple of things that got me thinking, and it just comments. I really don't need any long conversation about it. But the exhaustion of our work, the work that we do, that I usually like to use the term spirit injury, that the everyday acts of every little thing, the hypervigilance, the defensiveness, the times when you really need to censor yourself or not censor yourself, the times when you don't want to be a mentor or to be a public intellectual, but it gets forced onto you. And I say forced onto you, not necessarily meaning it's a bad thing. And I'll give you an example very, very quickly. I remember the year that I won the Distinguished Teaching Award. We used to have the support office on campus, SEBS. And I was sitting in my office and the two young students of color, female students of color, came running into my office and said, "Hi, Professor Deschamps, we won." And I said, "We won?" They were from New Jersey. And I said, "There was, did you win the lottery in New Jersey?" And they both laughed. And then they said, "We won the teaching award." And it was a moment of pause for me to think, oh, I do have a responsibility to the students. It was a really eye-opening moment for me to think about the push and pull of doing the work that we do. And the other thing that I grappled for years, and many of my wonderful colleagues in WGSS, which I'll talk about much later, allowed me the space to be is for a long time I grappled with, well, the US Black feminism didn't speak to me. Nor did white feminism speak to me. So where was my space? So I had to carve out my own third space and actually spend my time doing reality pedagogy to give me a sense of being, a sense of validating that my growing up in the Caribbean among strong women and a very women-centered community meant that, which I didn't call Black feminism at the time, but that was the work that we always did. So Jennifer, thanks. We've always did that work. We've come to the table now with all of these experiences that we have, that we owe it to our students to just move them on and to rethink. I'm going to leave it there because, I could talk forever and that everybody knows that's my soapbox. But thank you for bringing those things to the table and for Britt for asking those questions, and looking forward to more work on this. The hypervigilance is very important to our students. It hurts your heart when a student comes and says, Professor Deschamps, every day I walk back, I wonder, will I see the N-word on my door? I mean, what do you do with that? How do you, where's the, that feeling, you feel the nausea yourself and you have to take care of that student. And I think that's the hard work that we do and the work that our colleagues need to allow us to do in our own time. So thank you.
Jen, do you want to say anything to respond?
Yeah, I mean, two things. One is, as you were talking, Alex, I thought of that Jackie Alexander quote, we weren't born women of color, but became women of color here. And then Rachel Lee taking it a step further. I became a woman of color at UCLA when I was hired to teach the Women of Color Feminism course, right? And so I think I have a chapter in the book where I try, as I said, transnational feminism is not my field. And I was always very interested in how there was a category called Black feminism, which Black women were supposed to teach. And there was a category called transnational feminism, which women of color who were not Black were supposed to teach. And so that was how the field was mapped. And so it meant that Black feminism was always already tethered to the US, right? And then you get someone like Jackie Alexander and just nobody knows what to do with her pedagogically, right? And so I think one of my questions about, we should not assume that we already know what Black feminism can do and what its explanatory powers are or what its objects are. One of the things I want to trace in that book is what happens if we ask intersectionality and transnationalism to think together. How might that actually interrupt the kind of US centricness of Black feminism? On responsibility, absolutely. I mean, I think that's such an important point, right? That we have a responsibility, that I feel an intense responsibility to my students. And I also, going back to the comments about rank and how it structures academic life, I feel an intense responsibility to my junior colleagues who are women of color and Black women, right? And so there are various kinds of responsibilities that produce various forms of exhaustion. These are embodied feelings, right? They produce various forms of exhaustion and thus require care, not in the way that the dean says it, right? Like, take a wellness day and you'll be fine, right? I think one of the questions that we see Black feminists continuing to struggle with, particularly sort of like post sort of 2016, is what does care mean, and can care have institutional forms, or is it, as Sean Crowley suggests, sort of always inherently anti-institutional? So I just want to echo your sense of the importance of thinking about responsibility and what we owe each other, right? I think that's a Black feminist question.
That's great, thanks. I think, let's see, a question from Shelley Perdomo. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
It wasn't a question, it was a comment, and the comment was for Alex, and it was, speak.
Great. I love that. Do we have other questions? We have about, this is kind of amazing. We have like 8 minutes here to still talk. You can put in chat, and if you want to just unmute and ask a question, that's fine as well.
Hi, I'd like to say something or ask something. I don't know. First of all, I can't even describe how thrilled I am to be in this space with all of this amazing talent, and Alex and the department. It's just exciting. I'm just wondering about, like, I think that there's so much work still to be done. And there's, and I feel like even in the institution that I am in, it's been important to kind of situate, intersectionality and these ideas in teaching all topics, right? So I'm just wondering if you have some, some points that we should, I feel like I want to take advantage of the council that's in the space, right? And so I'd like to ask, Alex, and then, Dr. Nash as well, like, so what else should we be trying to do, right? As teachers, as WGS practitioners, as activists, right? And what are the other kinds of things that we should try to pass along?
Why, oh why, Aliyah? That is so you asking those questions. I don't even know how to answer them, but I'll tell you that one of the things I think that's extremely important right now, it's the urgency of the moment and the time and the nation and our students who are grappling with what to do. And how do we create the spaces that we can challenge them and motivate them to use every skill that they have and to bring it to fruition. And how do we help all of our young, young gifted and Black, or young gifted and Latina, or young gifted and Asian? How do we get those kids in our classrooms, and what is our own sense of urgency and our pedagogy to teaching from a strengths perspective? What are they bringing to us? How do we use it, and not treating them as always being deficit? They are not deficit. They're bringing all their cultural skills and everything else that they have learned. I think I can only speak for myself. I've always seen my work as harnessing that and then trying to figure out how to use it. The draconian method sometimes in a classroom has always bothered me. I mean, I would buck the system when I was 18 years old. So I understand that they will buck the system when they're 18 years old. So, I can't give you theoretical stuff now. I can only give you the reality of what I do on a daily basis in the classroom and with the students that I interact all the time with emerging scholars, and get them to the next level. But the other thing, if I've learned anything from my own women-centered family, which Black feminists now calls lift as you climb, they have to give back. You pay forward as you go, and we have to teach them how to do it. That's the nutshell I can give you right now, but I am so looking forward to hearing you this afternoon. I hope I have more time to speak with you. I love you.
Jen?
That was such a great answer. I guess I would just add one thing. I mean, one of the things I always notice when I teach is how the institution can rob students of imagination. And so often, I'm thinking of moments when I've taught Sylvia Federici's Wages Against Housework, and my students will say, but that's not possible, it's utopian, right? And I always think of this great moment when Kathy Weeks is like, perhaps our problem is not that we're too utopian, but that we're not utopian enough in our thinking, right? And so part of what I want my students to do is to reclaim their imaginations. So I often find myself asking, like, what do you want? What is the world that you want? Who are you going to be in that world? How will you relate to other people in that world? Let's dream big and treat the classroom as a laboratory for cultivating imagination again. So that's just one small thought.
It robs us of imagination too. When I look back at what I was doing when I was on the tenure track, producing books, commuting, going to conferences, reproducing, it was so intense. And I look back and there was little, I really liked teaching, and being on the tenure track, I felt like I had no time to think about students or to focus on students because of everything else that I was asked to do. And that's kind of a shame, And so it is also about, I think it robs us of imagination too. And it just takes a lot of unlearning and undoing because we are so intensely interpolated into that. Okay, I'm going to show some bias and call on my student, Sophia, who's a major in Afro-American Studies and in my class this semester. Sophia, I know you've been very excited about this conversation. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Professor Rusert. And first, Professor Nash, yeah, I'm obsessed. I love your book a lot. I have a question about thinking about Black feminist pedagogies, in particular as someone that identifies as an abolitionist and transformative justice practitioner. I really want to center myself in grassroots organizing in Boston, where I live. And so I was wondering if there was any tips and tricks in terms of bringing Black feminist pedagogies to the youth. I have a lot of youth in high school. I have a little sister in Boston public schools that's like, yo, I need to learn this stuff. Like, what's the vibe? So how I've been trying my best to, I guess, make it colloquial and engaging, and also reaffirming their experiences because they're doing it. So just, I would love to know, how as a collective in college institutional settings, we can really engage with our communities when it comes to Black feminist pedagogies and abolitionist pedagogies as well.
I can thank you, by the way, Sophia, for those kind comments. That was so kind. That was really just generous of you. It's so funny. Like people often ask me about this question of like, how do we bring our knowledge to younger people? And I always think whenever I work with younger people, they bring me their knowledge, right? Like I think, and one of the things that really strikes me is how much the language that I learned in college around intersectionality and transnationalism is the language that they're using now, right? So I think part of what's so important in my own experiences, like when I've talked to high school students or even younger, is I'm not interested in teaching them my jargon or my language. I'm interested in having them tell me their experiences, because I think they're already privy to how power works and how it feels. And so I think there's a great article, Sophia, by the amazing June Jordan called "Nobody Mean More to Me Than You." If you haven't read that article, I highly recommend it. I teach it obsessively because I think it takes up so many of the questions that you're asking, because in part what June Jordan is saying is that the work of Black feminist pedagogy is meeting people where they are and knowing that they know more about their experiences and realities than you ever will, right? And so I think she offers a kind of blueprint there. There's one other person who I think of, my former colleague at Northwestern, Kiana Ross, is doing a really interesting ethnographic project on public schools in the Bay Area that have essentially, it's interesting, they were using the term women's studies, that have women's studies classes, and particularly Black women's studies classes. And so she went and sat in on those classes and is trying to think about how the girls who were part of those spaces were describing experiences of violence, questions around sexuality and intimacy, grappling with creating community and friendship in the space of the class, dealing with conflict in the space of the class. So thinking through all of the questions that I teach about in my Black feminist theory class, for example. So anyway, that's some preliminary thoughts.
I really like ending with a student question and a response about students in the spirit of Alex's work and mentorship. And I know we have a tight schedule. So Jen, I wanted to thank you for being in conversation with me.
We had one question from Lisa Moore, who's had so should we just take that and then wrap up?
Okay, that's fine with me. The other option is Jen could respond if Lisa wants to put it in chat, could respond in chat. If you want to stay on schedule, it's completely up to you, Banu.
No, let's take the last question, since the hands up we've been for a while now.
Okay, sounds good.
So hi, this is, hi, I'm Lisa Moore. I'm a director of social work at University of Chicago, and I'm a former student with Alex, and just thinking about care and how important it is to think about Black feminist ideas in spaces where people are being trained to care for others. I just got done teaching a class on relational cultural theory and Black feminist theory, and at the end of the class, my students wept. They wept because they had never been exposed to this idea of care, and were surprised that it was not found in social work literature. It was found in Black feminist theory. And so when pairing the two together, how important it is. So I just wanted to express my appreciation for highlighting the value of care and setting up spaces where people can show up in these different ways.
Thank you for that, Lisa. I mean, I think, yeah, you said it so brilliantly. And I think so many of us who teach in this field have had that experience, right? Where students articulate how unusual it is to come to the space of a classroom and be asked to be embodied, to be met as embodied beings, right? Or to be engaged as affective beings. When I teach my affect seminar, which is a graduate class, I always ask my students to bring in, I call it the price of admission, borrowing from Katie Stewart, and they have to write a response, an emotional response to the readings. And the first couple, and I ask folks to read it out loud, and I write one as well. And the first couple of weeks, being graduate students, they write deeply analytical responses to the text, right? And so, and then something shifts over the course of the semester, and we learn that we don't have to do that anymore, that we can surrender the performative, and that we can actually, which is so hard, right? We can actually talk about, how did this reading sit with you? How did you feel about it? How did you respond to the language? Like, what did it remind you of? And the class develops this intensity and intimacy very quickly. And I realized that because I do the same, I bring my response every week. So I'm with them in that experience. Everything about the classroom shifts, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think when I said earlier, I think students are taught so early to kind of foreclose the imagination. I also think they're taught so early that the classroom is not a space for feeling, for being embodied. And so I think part of the work of CARE is to fundamentally remake the possibilities of what the classroom can produce. So thank you for that.
Ironically, I feel like I've only been thinking about that embodied presence and those embodied needs since we've been on Zoom, because it's so obvious that those needs aren't being met. And so I hope once we're back together and, in person, that people will, instructors will be more attentive to those dynamics as well, those kind of embodied needs within the classroom. Thanks again, Jen. This has been just absolutely fascinating and fabulous, and a great way to start off the afternoon's events. I am going to turn it back over to Banu.
Yes, thank you
Thanks
so
again,
much, Jen and Britt. This was wonderful. We are literally going to take 2 minutes, and then while we set up and start with the next event. Thank you.
Thank you.